I never liked the Beatles. I never really liked any British group. I don't think the British...
Paul McCartney, the charming Beatle with the unforgettable voice and timeless melodies, is one of the most celebrated musicians in history. From his legendary partnership with John Lennon to his solo success with Wings, McCartney's career has spanned over 6 decades, influencing nearly every generation of music lovers. But behind the fame, smiles, and peace signs lies a much more complicated story. Because while millions adored him, not everyone in the music industry felt the same way. In fact, some of the biggest names in rock, pop, and punk openly despised Paul McCartney. They called him arrogant, controlling, and too polished for their taste. And they didn't hold back in saying so. It's almost shocking to think that someone who wrote classics like Hey Jude and Let It Be could spark so much resentment. But McCartney's perfectionism and sharp business instincts often rubbed other artists the wrong way. From fellow rock legends who clashed with his ego to former collaborators who accused him of betrayal, McCartney's list of enemies is longer than most fans realize. In this video, we'll reveal the 6 famous musicians who absolutely couldn't stand Paul McCartney and the surprising reasons behind their dislike. From heated studio fights to public insults and decades-long grudges, these stories will show a side of McCartney that's rarely talked about. Let's dive in, starting with a rock icon who thought McCartney's nice guy image was nothing but an act. There was a time when John Lennon and Paul McCartney were inseparable, 2 young dreamers from Liverpool who changed the face of music forever. Together, they created songs that defined a generation and transformed the Beatles into the most famous band in the world. But as their fame grew, so did the cracks in their friendship. What began as a powerful creative partnership slowly turned into one of rock's most heartbreaking rivalries. In the early days, Lennon admired Paul's musical talent and discipline. He once called him the best bass player in the world. But behind the praise, there was tension. Paul was meticulous and controlling in the studio, while John preferred spontaneity and raw emotion. As the Beatles became bigger, Paul's drive to perfect every song often clashed with John's free-spirited approach. By the late 1960s, their creative differences had reached a breaking point. Paul wanted to keep the Beatles together, but he also wanted to run things his way. Lennon, meanwhile, felt suffocated, convinced that McCartney was turning the band into his personal project. During the recording of Let It Be in Abbey Road, their arguments became legendary. Lennon would storm out of sessions while Paul kept pushing for more takes and tighter arrangements. The tension spilled into their personal relationship. Lennon once said in frustration, "Paul took over and didn't give me much space." When the Beatles finally broke up in 1970, the split wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Lennon and McCartney, once as close as brothers, were now enemies in the public eye. John's anger came pouring out in his solo music. His 1971 track, How Do You Sleep, was a brutal attack aimed directly at Paul. With scathing lyrics like, "The only thing you'd done was yesterday," Lennon mocked his old partner's music as shallow and commercial. It was one of the harshest musical feuds ever recorded. Paul responded quietly through songs like Too Many People, subtly criticizing Lennon for abandoning the Beatles and embracing self-righteous activism. Their rivalry played out in interviews, too. Lennon accused McCartney of being insincere and only interested in money. He claimed Paul wanted to be the boss of everyone, while Paul countered that John was manipulative and difficult. The once perfect image of Lennon and McCartney as songwriting soulmates had shattered, replaced by years of bitterness and blame. But beneath all the anger, there was still love, the kind only lifelong friends can share. Despite their public feud, both men occasionally reached out privately. In the mid-1970s, they began speaking again, mostly through phone calls. Friends who saw them together said they laughed like old times, teasing each other as if no years had passed. Tragically, their fragile reconciliation ended too soon. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was murdered outside his New York apartment. Paul was devastated. In one emotional interview, his voice cracked as he called John a great man and a great friend. Years later, Paul admitted that the anger between them had always been rooted in love. 2 creative giants competing for the same dream. Their feud remains one of rock's greatest what-ifs. What if they had reunited? What if Lennon had lived longer? No one knows. But what's certain is that their bond, as painful as it was, shaped both their lives and their music. John Lennon may have once hated Paul McCartney, but that hatred came from the deepest kind of connection, the kind only found between two men who built something extraordinary together, and then watched it fall apart. While the world focused on the fiery feud between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, few realized that another Beatle was harboring just as much frustration, George Harrison. Known as the Quiet Beatle, George was calm, spiritual, and introspective. But behind that quiet nature was an artist who felt overlooked, controlled, and deeply resentful of Paul's dominance inside the band. From the very beginning, George respected Paul's musical genius. He admired Paul's ability to craft melodies and perfect every note. But as the Beatles evolved, Paul's drive for control began to overshadow George's creative growth. Harrison was no longer the young guitarist content to follow Lennon and McCartney's lead. He was writing his own songs, full of depth and emotion. Yet Paul rarely gave him space to shine. During recording sessions, tensions often boiled over. Paul's perfectionism, the same trait that made the Beatles' music sound flawless, became unbearable for George. Paul constantly dictated how George should play his guitar parts, often ignoring his input altogether. During one heated session for the Let It Be album, George snapped in frustration, saying the now famous line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all. Whatever it is that will please you." That moment captured everything George felt: powerless, unheard, and tired of being treated like a background player in a band where he should have been an equal. George's resentment grew stronger as he continued to produce songs that rivaled Paul's and John's in quality. Tracks like Something and Here Comes the Sun proved his songwriting genius. Yet even then, Paul often pushed his own material to the front. In interviews, George later admitted, "I wasn't allowed to develop. Everyone else had done hundreds of songs, and I had done about 2 per album." Outside the studio, Paul's business decisions also rubbed George the wrong way. When the Beatles' manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, chaos erupted over who would handle the band's finances. Paul wanted his future in-laws, the Eastmans, to manage their affairs, while the other 3, George included, sided with Alan Klein. That disagreement drove a deeper wedge between them, leaving George feeling that Paul always wanted to take control of everything, both musically and financially. After the Beatles' breakup, George finally got the freedom he had longed for. His first solo album, All Things Must Pass, was a masterpiece, full of spiritual and emotional depth that many fans felt outshined Paul's early solo work. In interviews, George couldn't hide his relief, saying that he finally felt free from Paul's grip. Still, when asked about his former bandmate, he spoke with a mix of bitterness and compassion. "Paul is very talented," George once said, "but he can be a bit overpowering. He doesn't listen much." Their relationship thawed slightly in the later years, especially after John Lennon's death. Paul and George shared phone calls, met occasionally, and even played together during informal jam sessions. But the scars from those years never truly healed. George remained cautious around Paul, respecting his brilliance but keeping his emotional distance. When George Harrison passed away in 2001, Paul attended his funeral and spoke with deep affection, calling him "my little brother." Yet fans who knew their history could sense the lingering sadness. Their bond had been tested by ego, pride, and time, and while forgiveness had come, full reconciliation had not. In the end, George Harrison's quiet strength spoke louder than any feud. He may have hated Paul's controlling nature, but he never let that hate define him. Instead, he found peace through music, faith, and the freedom he'd spent years fighting for. And in doing so, he became more than the quiet Beatle. He became the one who found his own voice after years of being silenced. By the 1980s, Paul McCartney was already a legend, a Beatle, a global icon, and one of the most successful solo artists of all time. Yet, even after conquering the music world, Paul still craved the creative spark he once shared with John Lennon. He wanted someone who could challenge him, someone sharp, witty, and bold. That's when he turned to Elvis Costello, a younger, critically acclaimed songwriter known for his biting lyrics and rebellious attitude. What started as a promising partnership quickly turned into a clash of egos and artistic wills. In 1987, McCartney and Costello began writing together, hoping to rekindle the kind of dynamic that made the Beatles' music so timeless. At first, the chemistry was undeniable. They wrote a series of songs, including Veronica and My Brave Face, that blended McCartney's melodic instincts with Costello's lyrical edge. The early sessions were exciting, two brilliant songwriters trading ideas and pushing each other to be better. For a moment, it looked like McCartney had finally found his new Lennon. But the harmony didn't last long. Behind the scenes, their personalities couldn't have been more different. Paul was polished, careful, and focused on structure. Costello was raw, sarcastic, and fiercely independent. Elvis later admitted that working with Paul felt like a battle of wills. He admired McCartney's talent, but found his perfectionism overwhelming. Paul wanted every chord, lyric, and melody to be just right, while Costello preferred spontaneity, the emotion that comes from imperfection. As their sessions went on, the tension grew. Costello reportedly challenged McCartney on creative decisions, refusing to simply agree with him the way many of Paul's collaborators did. That didn't sit well with McCartney, who had spent decades being the driving force behind his projects. Elvis wanted to be an equal, not a student, and that clashed with Paul's need for control. Costello once joked in an interview, "Working with Paul is a bit like being in a boxing match. You throw a line, he throws one back, and before you know it, you're fighting for the last word." Their creative differences spilled into their public image as well. Critics began calling Costello the new Lennon, a comparison that made both men uncomfortable. McCartney didn't appreciate being reminded of his old partner, and Costello didn't want to be seen as anyone's replacement. Eventually, their partnership dissolved after just one album. While the songs they produced together were strong, the relationship was strained beyond repair. Paul moved on to other projects, and Elvis distanced himself, describing the experience as intense and exhausting. Though he acknowledged that McCartney was a musical genius, he also said he found Paul's relentless optimism and need for control stifling. In later years, McCartney looked back on the collaboration with mixed feelings. He praised Costello's intelligence and wit, but hinted that their personalities simply didn't mesh. "Elvis can be quite forceful," Paul said, "and so can I. Two bulls in the same pen." Still, their brief time together left a mark. Songs like Veronica remain among McCartney's strongest post-Beatles work, and even Costello admits that he learned from Paul's craftsmanship. Yet both men agreed on one thing: they were too similar to ever work comfortably side by side. The feud between Paul McCartney and Elvis Costello wasn't explosive or public like others, but it revealed something important about McCartney's character. He needed control, not out of arrogance, but because perfection was his comfort zone. To him, every song was a mission to make something lasting. To Costello, music was emotion, not calculation. Their clash was inevitable. And so what began as a promising reunion of great minds ended in quiet disappointment. Two brilliant artists walking away, each convinced the other just didn't understand. Few musicians have ever dared to publicly criticize Paul McCartney, but Noel Gallagher of Oasis never cared much for musical royalty. Known for his blunt honesty and endless bravado, Gallagher has made a career out of saying exactly what's on his mind. And when it comes to McCartney, his opinions have often been sharp, sarcastic, and filled with a strange mix of admiration and resentment. In the 1990s, when Oasis dominated the British rock scene, Noel and his brother Liam were often compared to the Beatles. Their swagger, style, and melodic sound carried echoes of the Fab Four, and Noel himself openly admitted that the Beatles were his biggest influence. "Without them," he once said, "there's no Oasis." But even while he praised the group as the greatest of all time, his feelings about Paul McCartney were complicated. At first, Noel respected Paul's genius, calling him the governor and praising his songwriting skills. But over the years, That admiration slowly turned into irritation. Gallagher often felt McCartney had become too soft, too focused on being the smiling, polite elder statesman of music. In one infamous interview, Noel sneered, "Paul's like your granddad at Christmas, still trying to impress everyone with the same old stories." To Noel, McCartney represented everything Oasis wanted to destroy: the overly polished, carefully managed image of rock superstardom. Gallagher's vision of rock was raw, loud, and full of rebellion. McCartney's world was perfection and charm. Noel's was chaos and honesty. That philosophical difference made McCartney an easy target for Gallagher's infamous insults. The tension deepened when McCartney publicly praised Blur during the height of the Blur vs. Oasis rivalry in the mid-90s. For Noel, that was a betrayal. Oasis had just become the biggest band in Britain, and McCartney's support for their rivals didn't sit well. He fired back in typical Gallagher style, calling McCartney a legend who's lost his edge. Over time, Noel's criticism took on a more personal tone. He accused McCartney of playing it safe and living off his Beatles legacy instead of taking real risks. In a 2013 interview, Noel remarked, "He's written enough songs for 10 lifetimes, but it's like he's forgotten how to be dangerous. Where's the attitude?" Despite his harsh words, there was always an underlying respect. Noel never denied McCartney's brilliance. In fact, he often acknowledged it before tearing him down again. "He's the best melody writer that's ever lived," Noel said. "But sometimes I wish he'd stop acting like everyone's favorite uncle." The truth is, Gallagher's feud with McCartney wasn't about hate. It was about identity. Noel grew up idolizing the Beatles, especially John Lennon, who embodied rebellion and honesty. Paul, on the other hand, symbolized control, harmony, and perfection, everything Noel wanted to break free from. To him, Lennon was the spirit of rock, while McCartney was the institution. Ironically, McCartney took the jabs in stride. He never responded with anger or insults. Instead, he laughed them off. When asked about Noel's comments, Paul once said, "He's just being Noel. I like Oasis. They remind me of us in the early days," full of confidence and mischief. It was a graceful response that showed McCartney's maturity, and perhaps why Gallagher's words never truly hurt him. In recent years, Noel has softened a little. He's admitted that deep down he admires Paul and even called him a national treasure. Still, the tension lingers. For Noel, McCartney will always be a symbol, the man who wrote the perfect pop song, but also the one who represents the system he wanted to challenge. Their strange relationship, half respect, half rebellion, captures the eternal divide in rock and roll, the perfectionist versus the provocateur, the legend versus the loudmouth. And while Noel Gallagher may hate Paul McCartney's safe image, he can't escape his influence. Every melody he's ever written carries a trace of the man he loves to mock and secretly wishes he could be.